On a cold, wind-cut morning in November 1620, a small wooden ship appeared through the grey Atlantic mist, its sails stiff with salt, and its hull groaning like an old animal that had survived too much. The passengers aboard had been at sea for 66 days. Many were sick, some were already dead, and none of them truly understood that the decisions they were about to make on that lonely stretch of shoreline would echo through centuries of American history. The ship was the Mayflower. It carried 102 passengers and around 30 crew members. They had not originally intended to land where they did. Their destination had been near the mouth of the Hudson River, in territory claimed by the Virginia Company. But storms, navigational errors, and the shifting currents of the North Atlantic had pushed them far north, to the sandy hook of Cape Cod. They were outside the bounds of their legal charter. This mattered. In early 17th century England, colonization was not a casual undertaking. It required royal approval, financial backing, and corporate charters. The Virginia Company had authority over a specific region. The Mayflower's passengers were now beyond it. Some among them, particularly the strangers, who were not part of the separatist religious group, began to mutter that no one had authority over them in this new land. In response, before anyone even stepped ashore, 41 adult men gathered in the ship's cramped cabin and drafted a document. It was brief. It pledged loyalty to King James. It declared their intent to form a civil body politic. It promised laws for the general good. This was the Mayflower Compact. It did not invent democracy. It did not establish independence. But it represented something profound, government by agreement among the governed, in the absence of immediate royal enforcement. In the dim lantern light of a rocking ship, they signed their names or marks, binding themselves to mutual survival. Outside, winter was closing in. The land they had reached was not empty. For thousands of years, native peoples had lived across the region. The specific area around Plymouth had recently been devastated by disease, likely introduced by earlier European contact. Between 1616 and 1619, epidemics, possibly smallpox, leptospirosis, or viral hepatitis, had swept through coastal New England. Entire villages were abandoned. Fields lay untended. When the Mayflower's passengers began exploring, they found cleared land and buried corn caches. They took some of that corn. They did not yet understand the world they had entered. The winter of 1620 to 1621 was brutal. The settlers lacked adequate shelter. Many remained aboard ship for weeks, exposed to freezing winds and inadequate nutrition. Scurvy and pneumonia spread. By spring, nearly half of the original passengers had died. Among the dead was William White. So was Edward Thompson, the first adult male to die after arrival. Many families were reduced to 1 or 2 survivors. Of the 18 married women who had embarked, only 5 lived to see the first harvest. And yet, the colony did not collapse. In March 1621, an event occurred that seemed, to the English settlers, almost miraculous. A native man walked into Plymouth and greeted them in English. His name was Samoset. He was an Abenaki Sagamore from Maine, who had learned English from fishermen and traders along the coast. He asked for beer. He spent the night, and he returned days later with another man, Tisquantum, known to history as Squanto. Squanto's story was extraordinary and tragic. Years earlier, in 1614, he had been captured by an English expedition led by Thomas Hunt, and sold into slavery in Spain. He escaped, traveled to England, and eventually returned to New England in 1619, only to find his entire Patuxet village wiped out by disease. He was one of the few survivors. When Squanto met the Plymouth settlers, he became their translator and guide. He taught them how to plant corn with fish as fertilizer. He showed them local fishing grounds. He helped negotiate an alliance with Massasoit, the sachem of the Wampanoag Confederacy. The Wampanoag had been weakened by disease and faced threats from rival tribes such as the Narragansett. The English settlers needed protection and knowledge. For a time, the arrangement worked. In autumn 1621, after their first successful harvest, the colonists held a feast. Wampanoag men, including Massasoit, arrived with deer. The gathering lasted 3 days. It included games, shooting, and shared meals. Centuries later, this event would be remembered, simplified and mythologized, as the first Thanksgiving. The reality was more complex. The early decades of the Plymouth Colony were marked by fragile coexistence. The population grew slowly. More ships arrived, land was cleared, livestock grazed. English legal structures expanded. Religion remained central. Many of the colonists were separatists, often called pilgrims, who had broken from the Church of England. They had fled to the Dutch Republic before sailing to America. They sought the freedom to worship as they chose, though they did not necessarily extend that freedom to others. In 1630, a larger and more organized migration began under the leadership of John Winthrop. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was established, separate from Plymouth. Winthrop envisioned a city upon a hill, a model Christian society that would inspire reform in England. The Puritans of Massachusetts Bay were not separatists, but reformers. They wanted to purify the Church of England from within. Yet in New England, they constructed tightly knit communities, governed by strict moral codes. Town meetings became a cornerstone of local governance. Adult male church members could vote. This system fostered a culture of civic participation. Laws were debated. Ministers preached on public morality. Harvard College was founded in 1636 to train clergy. But dissent was not tolerated easily. Roger Williams, a minister in Salem, argued for separation of church and state, and fair treatment of Native Americans. He was banished in 1636. He fled south and founded Providence, which became part of Rhode Island, a colony known for religious tolerance. Anne Hutchinson, a charismatic religious figure, held meetings in her home and criticized the colony's ministers. She was tried for heresy and banished in 1638. These conflicts revealed an enduring American tension, the balance between communal order and individual liberty. As English settlements expanded, so did conflict with native peoples. The Pequot War erupted in 1636. Tensions over trade and territorial expansion escalated into violence. In 1637, English forces and their native allies attacked a Pequot village near Mystic. Hundreds of Pequots were killed, many women and children. The brutality shocked even some contemporaries. The war ended with the near destruction of the Pequot tribe as a political entity. Surviving members were enslaved or absorbed into other tribes. The English victory opened large tracts of land for settlement. For decades afterward, uneasy peace prevailed in southern New England, but underlying pressures remained. In 1675, those pressures exploded into King Philip's War. Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, was the son of Massasoit. As English settlements expanded and colonial authorities demanded submission and land sales, native resistance grew. When 3 Wampanoag men were executed for the murder of a Christianized native informant, hostilities began. Native forces attacked English towns. Villages burned on both sides. King Philip's War was one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history relative to population. Entire towns were destroyed. Thousands died. Metacom was eventually killed in 1676. His body was mutilated, his head displayed on a pike in Plymouth for years. The war shattered native power in southern New England and accelerated English dominance. By the early 18th century, the English colonies along the Atlantic coast had grown significantly. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston developed into important ports. Trade networks linked the colonies to the Caribbean, Africa, and Europe. The Atlantic world was a system of exchange, of goods, ideas, and people. It was also a system of exploitation. Enslaved Africans were transported in horrific conditions across the Middle Passage. By the early 1700s, slavery was entrenched in the southern colonies and increasingly present in the north. Enslaved labor built wealth on tobacco plantations in Virginia, rice fields in South Carolina, and urban households in cities like New York. The contradictions of liberty and slavery would haunt American history from its inception. Colonial society was diverse and stratified. Wealthy merchants and planters accumulated land and influence. Small farmers struggled on the frontier. Indentured servants worked for years in exchange for passage to America. Women managed households and businesses, though they lacked formal political rights. Religious life evolved. The Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s brought emotional preaching and revivalism. Figures like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield challenged established churches and emphasized personal faith. The Awakening democratized religion in some ways. It also fostered networks of communication across colonies, contributing subtly to a shared American identity. Tensions with Britain mounted after the French and Indian War, the North American theater of a global conflict between Britain and France. Britain emerged victorious but deeply in debt. To recoup costs, Parliament imposed new taxes on the colonies: the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. Colonists protested taxation without representation. Boycotts spread, pamphlets circulated. In 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd in Boston, killing 5 colonists in what became known as the Boston Massacre. In 1773, colonists dumped tea into Boston Harbor in defiance of the Tea Act. Britain responded with punitive measures. The colonies organized the First Continental Congress. War followed. On April 19, 1775, shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. The Revolutionary War had begun. The conflict was long and uncertain. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, faced shortages of supplies and training. Loyalists remained within the colonies. Native nations and enslaved people navigated complex choices about alliances. The Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4, 1776, articulated principles of natural rights and popular sovereignty. It declared that all men are created equal, yet many were not free. After years of struggle, and with crucial French support, the colonies achieved victory. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized American independence. The new nation faced enormous challenges. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government was weak. Economic turmoil and internal unrest, such as Shays' Rebellion, highlighted instability. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. They debated representation, federal power, and slavery. Compromises were struck. The Great Compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Constitution created a stronger federal structure, with checks and balances. It required ratification by the states. The Bill of Rights was added in 1791, guaranteeing freedoms of speech, religion, and due process. The United States was an experiment. It was fragile. It was divided. Over the next decades, it expanded westward. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled its territory. Explorers Lewis and Clark mapped vast regions. Settlers moved into lands inhabited by native nations. Conflict followed expansion. In the 1830s, under President Andrew Jackson, the Indian Removal Act authorized forced relocation of native tribes from the southeast to lands west of the Mississippi. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole were among those displaced. The Cherokee had adopted a written constitution, established schools, and even won a Supreme Court case affirming their sovereignty. Yet enforcement failed. Thousands were forced west on the Trail of Tears. Many died from disease and exposure. Expansion also intensified the debate over slavery. New territories raised the question, would they be free or slave states? Compromises attempted to maintain balance. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Violence erupted in Bleeding, Kansas. Abolitionists and pro-slavery settlers clashed. The nation polarized. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Southern states seceded. The Civil War began in 1861. It was the deadliest conflict in American history. Battles at Antietam, Gettysburg, and countless lesser-known fields left staggering casualties. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in Confederate-held territory free. It transformed the war into a fight against slavery. In 1865, the Confederacy surrendered. Lincoln was assassinated days later. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th and 15th Amendments sought to guarantee citizenship and voting rights. Reconstruction attempted to reshape the South. For a brief period, Black Americans held political office. Public education expanded. New state constitutions were written. But white supremacist resistance, economic hardship, and political compromise undermined Reconstruction. By 1877, federal troops withdrew from the South. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation and disenfranchisement. The promises of equality remained unfulfilled. Meanwhile, industrialization transformed the nation. Railroads spanned the continent. Steel mills and factories rose in cities like Pittsburgh and Chicago. Immigrants from Ireland, Italy, Germany, Eastern Europe, and Asia arrived in waves. Cities grew crowded. Tenements housed families in cramped conditions. Labor movements organized for shorter hours and safer workplaces. Strikes sometimes turned violent. The Gilded Age produced immense wealth for industrialists and stark inequality for workers. In the West, the U.S. government waged wars against native nations. The bison herds were decimated. Reservations confined tribes to limited lands. At Wounded Knee in 1890, U.S. troops killed hundreds of Lakota. By the turn of the 20th century, the United States had become a global power. It acquired overseas territories after the Spanish-American War. It entered World War I in 1917. The 20th century would bring further upheaval. The Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement. Each era layered new complexities onto the American story. The nation that began as a fragile settlement on a cold New England shore became a continental republic, then a global superpower. Its history is marked by aspiration and contradiction, innovation and injustice, cooperation and conflict. The Mayflower's passengers could not have imagined skyscrapers, satellites, or nuclear weapons. They could not have foreseen civil rights marches or moon landings. But in their small, precarious act of self-government, drafting the Mayflower Compact in the dim cabin of a storm-tossed ship, they participated in a tradition that would evolve, fracture, and endure. History often feels distant. Names fade. Yet it is built from human choices made in uncertainty. In muddy streets and wooden halls, in battlefields and courtrooms, in farms and factories, Americans argued about power and freedom. They failed often, they struggled constantly, they persisted. And the quiet Atlantic shore, where a small ship once anchored, remains, in memory, one of the unlikely beginnings of a vast and unfinished experiment.